In the small corner of the bustling city, where everyone is hurriedly racing against life, there is an old, frail woman who only hopes to have enough money for dinner. And then, in that seemingly small moment, a stranger appeared, changing everything. Let's step into an emotional story about unexpected kindness, the rebirth of hope, and how an ordinary moment can touch the hearts of millions. At the same time, let us know where you are listening from. And if you like stories like this, please subscribe to the channel to hear more. Sunlight filtered through the dusty curtains, spilling into the small room where Mrs. Lillian knelt on the floor, scrubbing away the last traces of dirt beneath the table. The glossy tiled floor reflected her weary face, wrinkled skin and dark circles under her eyes, remnants of many sleepless nights. "Mrs. Harper, I've told you before. Don't leave these stains behind." The sharp voice of her employer echoed from the staircase, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Mrs. Lillian stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her trembling hand. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'll redo it right away." "Stop apologizing. If you can't do the job, I'll find someone else. If you want to keep this job, then do it properly." The employer stomped away, her high heels clicking loudly on the gleaming floor, leaving Mrs. Lillian standing there with her head bowed in silence. She glanced around the expansive house, every surface shining and immaculate, yet devoid of any warmth. Her hands shook as she gripped the mop again, biting her lip to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. By late afternoon, as pale golden light filtered through the high-rise buildings, Mrs. Lillian trudged out of the building's gates. The worn fabric bag slung over her shoulder swayed with each heavy step. The smell of car exhaust and the blaring horns mixed with the air, adding to her fatigue. Walking down the road, she eventually reached the small, moss-covered house where she and her son lived. Michael, her son, sat by the tiny window, his eyes fixed on the quiet street outside. He said nothing, only silently watched the streetlights reflect faintly on the glass, his hand unconsciously gripping the armrest of his wheelchair. His deep eyes, shadowed with unspoken sadness, carried a weight too heavy for his youthful face. Once a bright and promising young man, Michael had lost his ability to walk after a tragic accident. He now relied entirely on his mother. To cover the costs of living and his medical expenses, Mrs. Lillian took on various odd jobs, cleaning houses, doing laundry, and caring for other homes. Despite her advancing age and frailty, she pushed herself tirelessly, enduring the harsh words of her employers without complaint. "How was today, Mom?" Michael suddenly asked, his voice low, nearly merging with the stillness in the air. Mrs. Lillian turned to him, forcing a faint smile onto her lined face. "It's all fine, dear. Just a bit of a long day." She stood and walked to the small kitchen table where a few pieces of dry bread sat neatly on a cracked ceramic plate. "I think we can have some bread and eggs tonight. Tomorrow, I'll buy a bit of meat." Michael said nothing. He didn't respond, but his eyes flickered with a trace of guilt as he watched his mother's hands fumble through the last remaining coins on the table. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the window. The room fell quieter than ever, as though the world beyond had fallen asleep, leaving only the two of them living amidst the muted shadows. Mrs. Lillian reached for her coat, hanging neatly by the door. "I need to stop by the grocery store before they close. Stay home and rest, Michael. Don't worry, I'll be back soon." "Let me go with you." Michael hesitated, but Mrs. Lillian shook her head, her eyes resolute. "No need, son. Stay here. I'll be fine." She stepped outside, pulling the creaky wooden door shut behind her. Her footsteps echoed on the worn wooden stairs, steady and deliberate, as if reminding her of the difficult life she had to face every day. Mrs. Lillian walked along the familiar road, her steps slow, as if weighed down by the invisible burdens of her difficult days. The biting cold wind seeped through her thin coat, making her shiver slightly. In her bag, a few coins jingled softly with each step, a constant reminder that every expense had to be carefully measured. The road to the small grocery store felt longer than usual, even though she had walked it countless times before. The streetlights sparkled faintly, offering light but no warmth. The grocery store wasn't crowded, but the chilly atmosphere inside made her feel like an outsider. The cashier's voice echoed from behind the counter, blending with the repetitive beeps of the register. The rushed rhythm of the place left no room for someone like her, someone who couldn't keep pace with the world's relentless hurry. Mrs. Lillian carefully selected her items: a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, and the cheapest bottle of cooking oil she could find. Her fingers brushed against some pricier items on the shelves, but quickly moved on, leaving behind a quiet sense of longing in her eyes. She carried her choices to the counter, weighing each one with care. At the register, she gently placed her items on the counter. The cashier, a young man who didn't even bother looking up, muttered, $15.50. Mrs. Lillian cautiously pulled out the few coins she had, placing them on the counter. The clinking sound of the small coins rolling across the surface broke the heavy silence in the store. "You're 5 cents short," the cashier said coldly. She looked up, her eyes filled with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. This is all I have. Could I pay the rest later?" "Are you kidding me?" The cashier raised an eyebrow, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You can't even spare 5 cents. Come back when you have enough." Lillian stood frozen, flustered, her hands nervously clutching the edge of her bag as she tried to find the words to explain. But her tired voice seemed to vanish in the face of the young man's icy demeanor. "Please, just this once," she murmured. "I need the food for my son. Rules are rules. No money, no groceries." His indifferent tone sliced through her dignity like a blade. At that moment, it felt like time had stopped. The world around her seemed frozen, leaving Mrs. Lillian standing there, small and fragile in the face of such cold indifference. Suddenly, the store's door opened with a chime, and a tall young man stepped inside. The light from the overhead bulbs illuminated his face, a face that immediately caught the attention of everyone present. "Let me cover it," a deep, warm voice said, firm, yet without any hint of arrogance. The cashier looked up, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he recognized the man before him. Baron Trump stood there, calm and composed, but his gaze carried a sharp intensity. "You should treat people with more kindness," Baron said, his tone steady but commanding. "Not everyone is as fortunate as you." The cashier hesitated, momentarily flustered. Baron pulled out his wallet and placed a large bill on the counter. He then turned to Mrs. Lillian, his eyes softening. "It's all taken care of. You don't have to worry." Mrs. Lillian hesitated, unsure of what to say next. Her eyes glistened with tears, but no words came. Baron handed her a small envelope, his voice steady but gentle. "Take this. It will help you more than you think." She clutched the envelope tightly, her lips trembling as she tried to express her gratitude. Baron simply smiled, gave her a slight nod, and turned to leave. Standing there, holding the envelope, Mrs. Lillian felt its weight. Not just the material value it might contain, but the kindness and humanity that came with it. An unfamiliar warmth crept into her heart, melting away the cold sting of the evening. The chime of the grocery store door had long since faded, yet in the small, confined space, it seemed to linger. Mrs. Lillian stood motionless by the checkout counter, clutching the small envelope she had just received from Baron Trump. The warmth in his gaze still seemed to wrap around her, melting away the humiliation she had endured moments before. But the atmosphere in the store was different. Curious, skeptical glances continued to focus on her. The cashier, who had briefly been caught off guard by Baron's actions, was now hunched over the register, intently counting money as if nothing had happened. "Take it, ma'am," Baron said, his deep, warm voice breaking the heavy silence. Mrs. Lillian looked up, her teary eyes filled with hesitation. Thank you, truly, thank you." Baron smiled, a soft, understanding smile. "There's no need to thank me, you've had a long day, go home and rest." Yet Mrs. Lillian didn't leave immediately. There was something about Baron's presence that kept her rooted in place. It wasn't just gratitude, but a vague sense that his kindness was something rare, something she didn't often encounter in her hard, wearied life. Finally, she nodded slightly and hugged the bag of groceries to her chest. "God bless you," she whispered, more a prayer than a simple thanks. The road from the grocery store to her home felt shorter than usual. Or perhaps it was the strange sense of excitement she felt while thinking about the envelope in her hand. Each of her steps felt lighter, and her tired eyes held a faint glimmer of hope, even though the weight of her struggles still clung to her. When Mrs. Lillian returned home, the warmth of the modest kitchen welcomed her. Michael, seated at the table, looked up as she entered. "You're back," he said softly. "What happened? You seem different today." She placed the grocery bag on the table, sat down, and opened the small envelope with trembling hands. Michael watched intently as she pulled out a check for $50,000, its amount gleaming under the light. "Mom, what is this?" Michael asked, wide-eyed. "It's from the young man at the store," she replied, her voice shaky. "He helped me. He's so kind. I don't even know what to say." Michael stared at the check, then at his mother. "Who is he? How could a stranger do this?" He said, "Use this to lighten your burden." "That's all," she answered, still overwhelmed. Michael, astonished, leaned on the table. "Mom, this isn't normal. You have to tell me everything." She recounted the events, and her words seemed to deepen Michael's thoughts. Finally, he said, "Someone like him deserves to know the impact of what he did. I want to share this story online." Surprised but moved, Mrs. Lillian simply nodded. "All right, Michael, do what you think is right." The next morning, soft sunlight streamed through the narrow window of Mrs. Lillian's small room. Michael sat at the wooden table, his wheelchair pushed close so he could rest his laptop on the surface. His face looked thoughtful, his brows slightly furrowed as his fingers moved slowly across the keyboard. Mrs. Lillian stood nearby, drying the last dish in her hands. Each time she glanced at Michael, her eyes carried a mix of curiosity and concern. "What are you writing, Michael?" she asked gently, her voice almost hesitant, as if afraid to break the silence in the room. Michael paused, tilting his head to look at her. "I'm telling your story," he replied slowly. "About what happened yesterday. I think people should know about it." Mrs. Lillian hesitated, setting the dish down with a trace of unease. "But is that really necessary? We don't want to bother anyone." Michael shook his head, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "It's not a bother, Mom. I want others to know that people like Baron Trump exist. People who do good without expecting anything in return. And more importantly, I want to thank him in my own way." Mrs. Lillian stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her son's shoulder. "But do you think anyone will care? What will they think about me?" Michael turned to face her, his gaze softening. "Mom, you're an incredible mother. Everything you've done for me is something no one can deny. If anyone thinks otherwise, that's their problem, not yours." Mrs. Lillian fell silent, her lips parting as though to say something, but she only sighed and nodded. A few hours later, Michael pressed the post button. He had written a story that was raw and authentic, without embellishments or exaggerations. He described his mother, a strong woman who worked tirelessly to support her son, and the unexpected appearance of Baron Trump at the grocery store the night before. The story ended with a heartfelt thank you to Baron, expressing hope that his act of kindness would inspire others. Michael shared the story on social media, not thinking much about what might come next. He simply wanted to follow what his heart told him to do. By the afternoon, Michael's phone began buzzing constantly. Notifications from social media poured in. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening as the number of likes and shares grew with each passing minute. "Mom!" he called out, his voice breaking with excitement. Mrs. Lillian stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it, Michael?" "My post." "It's going viral, Mom," Michael said, holding out the phone to her. Mrs. Lillian took the phone and looked at the screen. The comments were overflowing with empathy and admiration. Someone wrote, "This story reminds me of my mother. She sacrificed so much for me too." Another shared, "Baron Trump is amazing. The world needs more people like him." Mrs. Lillian sat down, her hands trembling as she held the phone. "Really? Truly? So many people have read this story." Michael nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "See, Mum, so many people are touched by your story. I think I did the right thing." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Baron Trump received a message from his close assistant. It was a link to Michael's post. Sitting in his spacious office, Baron read every line. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. When he finished reading, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting out the window to the city skyline. A subtle smile appeared on his face, not because the post praised him, but because he realized his small action had truly made a difference in someone's life. Baron picked up his phone and spoke to his assistant. "Find a way to contact them. I want to meet this family." The assistant was surprised. "Meet them?" "But sir," Baron interrupted, his voice firm yet calm, "I have a feeling this is just the beginning of the story." And so, an invisible bond between three people, a frail mother, a resilient son, and a generous young man, was beginning to strengthen, carrying with it the hope that more goodness and light were yet to come. Soft sunlight streamed through the curtains, filling the small room with warmth. Michael sat quietly at the wooden table, his hands resting on the laptop keyboard, his eyes focused on the screen as notifications popped up, comments, shares, and messages from strangers pouring in. "Mom, people are talking about you," Michael said, his voice calm but tinged with excitement. Mrs. Lillian, busy preparing breakfast, stopped when she heard him. She turned, her expression a mix of curiosity and confusion. "Talking about me, Michael? About what happened yesterday?" "Yes. They're touched by what Baron Trump did, but they're also talking about you. Some say you're brave, and others are sharing stories about their own mothers." Michael angled the screen toward her. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the comments. "This story touched my heart. My mom also sacrificed everything to raise me." Another read, "Baron Trump is amazing. The world needs more people like him." She sank into a chair, her hands brushing the edge of the table. "I never imagined. It's just a small story, yet so many people care." Michael smiled faintly. "Sometimes small things can have a big impact, Mom." In his upscale apartment, Baron Trump stood before a large window overlooking the city. Behind him, his assistant Carter held a tablet displaying Michael's post. "The story is spreading fast, sir," Carter reported. "It caught media attention. A few reporters want to know if you'd like to comment." Baron turned, his sharp eyes reflecting contemplation. "No need. I don't want this to be overly publicized." Carter nodded but hesitated. "Why this family, sir? So many people need help, but you chose them." Baron walked to his desk and opened a notebook. "I didn't choose them, Carter. Sometimes life chooses us. That day, I just followed my heart." Carter remained silent, processing his words. Back at Mrs. Lillian's home, her old phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Michael scrolled through the messages. Some were words of gratitude, others asked for more information about Baron. "Mom, the media wants to know more about him," Michael said, his voice tinged with unease. "They want us to share more of the story." "The media?" Mrs. Lillian stepped back, shaking her head slightly. "I wouldn't know what to say. I'm not used to things like this." Michael sighed, setting the phone down. "I don't know either, but I think he doesn't want attention. What he did wasn't for fame." "That's right," she said softly. "He did it out of kindness. Don't make it something else, Michael." Michael nodded, an idea forming. "But Mom, we could give back, not for the media but for him. What are you thinking?" Michael didn't answer immediately. He opened an old wooden box and took out a photo of himself as a child, smiling beside his mother and an old bicycle, a picture he'd never shared before. "I'll write more. A thank you letter, not just for what he did, but to tell him how strong you are and how his actions changed our lives." Mrs. Lillian looked at her son, feeling her heart lighten. "If you believe it's right, do it. Just make sure it's sincere." Michael smiled, returning to his desk. "That's the only thing I'm sure of." The story continued to ripple outward, becoming more than a tale of kindness. It sparked gratitude, empathy, and a profound reminder of what true compassion means. On a sunny morning, Michael sat at his desk, finalizing a heartfelt letter to Baron Trump. The white envelope containing the letter rested neatly on the table. When Michael told his mother, Mrs. Lillian, that the letter was ready, she asked how he planned to send it. Michael explained that he had found Baron's office address and hoped it would reach him, acknowledging the uncertainty but emphasizing his desire to let Baron know how his actions had changed their lives. Mrs. Lillian, filled with quiet pride, simply nodded in approval. Meanwhile, Baron Trump was in a conference room, ignoring the surrounding discussions as he read Michael's letter, which had been promptly delivered by his assistant. In the letter, Michael recounted his mother's resilience and sacrifices and expressed gratitude for Baron's simple but impactful kindness at the grocery store. He wrote that Baron's actions not only provided material help, but also restored a sense of hope they hadn't felt in years. Moved by the letter, Baron decided to meet the family in person. A few days later, a black SUV arrived at Mrs. Lillian's modest home. Baron, carrying himself with humility, knocked on the door, surprising Mrs. Lillian. She welcomed him inside, where she sat down with Michael for an honest and heartfelt conversation. Baron admitted that he hadn't acted for recognition or thanks, but was deeply touched by Michael's letter. He shared that the letter reinforced his belief that small acts of kindness could make a significant difference. Michael expressed his gratitude, explaining how Baron's actions had transformed their lives and reminded them that goodness still existed in the world. The conversation created a warm connection between the three, despite their vastly different backgrounds, united by a simple but meaningful act of kindness. The story concludes with the profound lesson that even small gestures, like an outstretched hand or a kind word, can profoundly impact someone's life. Through Baron's actions, Michael and Mrs. Lillian rediscovered hope, and the ripple effect of his kindness inspired others to believe in the enduring power of compassion amidst life's challenges. This narrative highlights the transformative potential of simple, selfless acts, reminding us of the importance of empathy and the enduring impact of kindness. This story also reminds us that behind every person lies a story we don't know. So treat everyone with empathy and understanding. What you consider small might hold enormous meaning for someone else. What do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced an act of kindness that changed your perspective on the world? Share your story in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else.